Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy corners of medieval legends. Before we dive in, make sure you hit like and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying the stories I share here, and drop a comment with your location and the time where you are. It always amazes me how many of you tune in from all over the world. All right, lights low. Maybe turn on a fan for that eerie background hum, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. If your picture of Vikings is just towering warriors, swinging axes and roaring like they've stubbed a toe in Valhalla, well, congratulations, you've already met the Berserkers. These were the original rage quitters of history, fighters who, according to Norse sagas, would enter a trance-like fury in battle, shrugging off pain, fear, and, let's be honest, any sense of subtlety. For a long time, historians thought these wild warriors were just literary exaggerations. Ancient texts are full of dragons, magic swords, and men turning into beasts mid-battle. So surely this was just metaphor, right? Well, maybe not. Archaeology has started to connect some very strange dots. Let's begin with fashion. Several Viking graves have revealed warriors buried with animal pelts, bear and wolf skins being the most common. Maybe it was symbolic. Maybe they liked dressing the part before cosplay was even a thing. But then the mystery deepens. Enter mushrooms. Specifically, Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted fungi you've probably seen in fairy tales or even video games. Cute in cartoons, but in reality, it's psychoactive. And yes, it naturally grows in Scandinavia. Eating it doesn't just make you see pretty colors, it can trigger euphoria, detachment from reality, sweating, shaking, and, according to some theories, the kind of frenzy where you're ready to wrestle your neighbor's livestock. Now, mix that with intense chanting, fasting, and pre-battle rituals, and suddenly you've got a chemically supercharged tornado of rage charging into battle with an axe. Imagine you're a monk in a quiet monastery, and out of the woods comes a half-naked warrior, foaming at the mouth. Not exactly the welcoming committee you hoped for. Contemporary accounts describe these men as unstoppable, fearless, even biting into their shields, not for protection, but possibly to keep control during violent convulsions. Totally normal Saturday night activities, right? The word berserk has stuck around in our language, but back then, it wasn't just slang. It was a devastating weapon of psychological warfare. Picture trying to hold a disciplined shield wall, while a hallucinating Norseman in a bear skin comes screaming toward you like he just stepped out of a heavy metal concert. Strategy meets chaos, and speaking of chaos, fast forward to 1518. In the city of Strasbourg, France, despair, famine, and disease were crushing the people. Their answer, dancing. Not poetic dancing, not romantic ballroom steps, literal, non-stop dancing until exhaustion broke their bodies. Some collapsed, some died, and the city leaders even debated banning music altogether, thinking it might be safer than chasing witches. It began with just one woman, Frau Trophea, who stepped into the street and began dancing. No band, no crowd, just raw, relentless movement. Hours passed, people gathered, and instead of urging her to rest, they started joining in. Because apparently, in 1518, the sight of someone dancing themselves into collapse wasn't a warning sign, it was an invitation. Within just a few days, what started with a single dancer grew into dozens, then hundreds, and no, this wasn't some cheerful festival. Imagine hundreds of people moving uncontrollably in the middle of the street, under the brutal summer sun, without food, without water, without any sense of self-preservation. Honestly, if TikTok had existed back then, it might have gone viral, minus the mass casualties. What's even stranger is how the city officials responded. Instead of stopping the chaos, isolating the dancers, or calling in doctors, they doubled down. They actually hired musicians, built a stage, and encouraged the dancers to keep going until the frenzy burned itself out. Yes, their medical solution to death by dancing was essentially to turn up the medieval bass. Shockingly, that didn't work. For centuries, scholars argued whether the event was real or just another morality tale from a time when bleeding someone with leeches passed for healthcare. And astrology was basically career counseling. But here's the kicker. There are tons of surviving records. City documents, church logs, even personal letters all describe the same unsettling truth. People danced involuntarily, and some never made it out alive. So what caused it? Historians debate between two main theories. First, ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye, which can trigger convulsions, visions, and some truly terrible decision-making. Second, mass psychogenic illness, essentially collective hysteria, sparked by overwhelming stress, fear, and a serious lack of hobbies in medieval Europe. Whatever the cause, the result was a month-long grim disco that claimed lives. And if there's a moral to the story, it's this. Medieval Europe didn't always burn witches. Sometimes it threw them a dance party. Now, if there's one thing the Middle Ages were really good at, it was turning hope into disaster with impressive speed. Case in point, the Children's Crusade of 1212. On paper, it sounds like something out of a Disney movie. In reality, it plays more like a dark comedy about human decision-making. Here's how the legend goes. A shepherd boy in France, yes, his actual name was Stephen, claimed he had received a divine message straight from Jesus. The command to lead a peaceful army of children to the Holy Land. Not armed with swords or shields, but with purity and innocence. Spoiler alert. Innocence isn't very effective against trained soldiers, raging storms, or, well, reality. Still, thousands of kids joined. Parents wept, crowds cheered, and bishops just stared in disbelief. Yet off they went, across mountains, through rivers from town to town, singing hymns, going hungry, occasionally getting arrested. Think of it as a medieval field trip, minus chaperones, and plus divine hallucinations. For a long time, most historians thought the whole thing was just a myth, maybe a cautionary tale written by monks. Don't send your kids to Jerusalem without adult supervision. But over time, archival documents, church records, royal decrees, city notes suggest that something very real did happen, and it involved a lot of very young, very determined feet. As for the outcome, that depends on which version you believe. Some were turned back at the Alps. Many likely died along the way. Others were reportedly tricked by greedy merchants, loaded onto ships, and sold into slavery in North Africa. So instead of divine liberation, the Mediterranean didn't part for them, it cashed in on them. Modern scholars now suggest that the so-called Children's Crusade wasn't entirely made up of children at all. Most participants were probably teenagers or poor peasants. They were called pueri, a Latin word that conveniently means both children and servants. And so the legend grew. The delusion, the sincerity, the scale of the mistake. That part remains painfully true. Now picture this. It's a quiet afternoon in 14th century France. A pig escapes its pen, bites a child, and instead of simply slaughtering the animal, the villagers put it on trial. Yes, with a lawyer, a judge, and a proper courtroom. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't just blind, it was wildly imaginative. Animals were literally put on trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. They were assigned defense attorneys, sometimes jailed, and even excommunicated. One rooster was banished from church for allegedly laying an egg that people believed had been spawned by the devil himself. Because, of course, why not? For centuries, many assumed these were just folk tales, scribes embellishing dull records of grain taxes and fish quotas. But no, real court documents survive, actual parchment describing these bizarre proceedings. One of the most notorious cases comes from Falaise, France, in 1386. A sow was convicted of killing a child and sentenced to death. She was dressed in human clothes, paraded through town, and then publicly hanged. A disturbing mix of symbolism, retribution, and pure medieval weirdness. And it didn't stop with pigs. Even insects found themselves in the dock. In 1510, a group of peasants in France took a swarm of weevils to court for destroying their crops. The court, with a straight face, appointed a lawyer to represent the bugs, probably the punishment for someone who had annoyed the judge. After several hearings, the case was dropped. The insects, predictably, failed to appear in court. Classic defendant move. As bizarre as it sounds, there was logic behind it. Medieval people believed justice extended to all of God's creation. Animals, though lower than humans, were still part of the divine order. If they caused harm or were suspected of being influenced by evil, they could and should face judgment. Some trials were run by the church, others by secular courts, but all show just how far humans will go to treat anything with legs and a bad attitude as a criminal. And speaking of medieval punishment, let's talk about one of the most infamous torture devices of all time, the Iron Maiden. You've seen it in museums, horror movies, and probably in some edgy teenager's sketchbook. A human-sized metal coffin lined with spikes on the inside, supposedly used to turn prisoners into human pincushions. Here's the twist. It's a complete historical hoax. The Iron Maiden, despite its terrifying reputation, was never actually used during the Middle Ages. Yes, medieval torturers had more than enough cruel methods at their disposal, but this wasn't one of them. So where did it come from? The first so-called Iron Maiden seems to have been cobbled together in Germany sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s. Likely by someone who thought this museum exhibit could really use a big spiky prop. It was pure spectacle, a horror story dressed up as history, and it worked. By the 19th century, the Iron Maiden had become a crowd-pleasing symbol of medieval brutality that never actually existed. Audiences couldn't get enough of the Iron Maiden. After all, nothing draws a crowd like a gruesome mix of fake history and blood-soaked imagination. Even museums played along. You can still find Iron Maidens on display today, complete with signs that politely admit, by the way, this is a 19th century replica of something we completely made up. Now, don't get me wrong. Medieval torture was very real, and creativity was not in short supply. Racks, thumb screws, the heretic's fork, even a nasty little device called the Pear of Anguish, which, despite its name, was definitely not part of the fruit basket. But the Iron Maiden, not on the menu. People in the Middle Ages were too busy being horrible in more practical ways. So why did the myth survive? Simple. It felt true. It fit the stereotype of a brutal, superstitious age. And visually, it was perfect. An unforgettable icon of cruelty that haunted the imagination. which is why a fake torture chamber ended up becoming one of history's most enduring symbols of medieval barbarism. Now, let's bust another long-standing myth about the Middle Ages, the flat Earth. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europeans did not think the world was flat. They had plenty of problems: plague, famine, and the occasional sword-wielding cousin showing up uninvited, but mistaking the planet for a pancake wasn't one of them. In fact, most educated people in the Middle Ages knew the Earth was round. Monks, scholars, sailors, they all understood it. School texts from the 1200s explained the Earth's spherical shape, usually alongside a gentle reminder that you'd burn in hell if you failed your Latin lessons. The whole flat Earth Middle Ages idea was a much later invention, cooked up in the 19th century to make the Renaissance and Enlightenment look like massive upgrades. Basically, it was historical marketing. Those poor medieval fools thought the world was flat, and then we swooped in with science. In reality, medieval thinkers like Isidore of Seville, Bede the Venerable, and Thomas Aquinas were already building on Aristotle's arguments for a round Earth, and there were plenty of practical observations too. Ships disappearing over the horizon, round Earth, the curved shadow during a lunar eclipse, round Earth, the fact that the night sky in Spain looked different than the night sky in Egypt, once again, round Earth. Medieval logic might have been part divine revelation, part guesswork, and part Latin mumbling, but on this point, they nailed it. So where did the confusion come from? A few quotes pulled out of context, and a whole lot of 19th century spin. Washington Irving, you know, the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, penned a fictionalized biography of Columbus that made it sound like he was the first brave soul to prove the Earth was round. Spoiler, he wasn't. Speaking of justice and medieval myths, imagine being accused of theft in a small village. No CCTV, no fingerprints, no detective work. Just you, a priest, a mob of curious neighbors, and a bubbling pot of boiling water. Welcome to the world of trial by ordeal, where guilt or innocence was decided not by evidence, but by divine intervention, and usually third-degree burns. There were multiple versions of these ordeals, all of them designed to make you regret every decision that led you to this point. One of the most infamous methods of medieval justice was the ordeal of hot iron. The accused had to carry a glowing bar of iron for several paces. If the burns healed quickly, it was proof of innocence. If not, well, you clearly had God's disapproval stamped on your skin. Then came the ordeal of boiling water. The test: reach into a pot of boiling water to grab a stone. If your hand healed smoothly, you were declared innocent. If it looked like a pizza left too long under a heat lamp, guilty. And finally, the ordeal of cold water, which sounded easier but wasn't. The accused was tied up and tossed into a river. If they floated, it meant the water, being pure, had rejected them, so they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but also dead. You can see the design flaws. Now, modern minds might dismiss all this as barbaric nonsense. And yes, you'd have a point. But here's the twist. Sometimes, trial by ordeal worked, not through miracles, but through psychology. Guilty people often confessed before risking it, or settled outside of court. Priests, too, frequently bent the rules, letting the water cool, judging burns with flexibility, and quietly steering the outcome. They weren't always sadists, more often just medieval bureaucrats in robes. Eventually, in 1215, the church banned ordeals altogether. Someone finally admitted that burning and drowning people probably wasn't the height of divine wisdom. From then on, Europe slowly shifted to more rational legal systems. Like duels, witch trials, and accusing your neighbor of making shady deals with frogs. Now, let's turn to a legend everyone knows, Robin Hood, the outlaw in green with perfect archery skills, perfect hair, and a perfectly wrinkle-free tunic, despite living in the woods, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, and serving as medieval England's answer to Hollywood's leading man. Sounds great, right? Almost too great. That's because the Robin Hood we know today is about 90% literary invention and maybe 10% grounded in real history. But here's the fun part. Someone like Robin Hood probably did exist, or rather, several someones. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries list fugitives with names suspiciously close to Robin Hood, Robhad, Hobahad, and even Robert's Hood. These weren't glamorous rebels. Most were petty criminals, deer poachers, tax dodgers, or men who annoyed the wrong sheriff. No grand banquets under oak trees, just a lot of running, hiding, and scraping by. Over time, their stories blended into a composite figure, almost like a medieval fan fiction project, except this version involved blood, feuds, and the occasional plague. The earliest ballads show Robin as a violent outlaw, quick-tempered and disturbingly fond of killing monks. Maid Marian doesn't appear until later retellings. As for Friar Tuck, early versions suggest he'd dunk you in a pond before listening to your confessions. By the Tudor period, though, Robin Hood had been rebranded, no longer a murderous rebel. He became a merry rogue with a heart of gold, an early champion of wealth redistribution. In short, nothing says medieval England quite like a 16th century political makeover. So, was there ever a real Robin Hood? Probably not one single man. Instead, the legend grew out of very real conditions: corrupt officials, starving peasants, and forests that practically begged for cinematic storytelling. The myth needed a hero, and so ballads, folklore, and a few fugitive names and court records fused into one outlaw who never actually lived, but somehow became immortal. Now, when you hear the term Black Knight, your mind might jump straight to some brooding figure in battered armor, lurking in shadows, like a medieval Batman with questionable dental care. But in actual history, the Black Knight wasn't an evil sorcerer or a Monty Python parody. It was usually just a nickname given to knights who wore black armor, bore a dark coat of arms, or belonged to noble families with black-colored livery. That's it. No necromancy, no cursed blood oaths, just medieval color coordination. One of the most famous examples was Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, a 14th century English prince and military commander. He was admired by some, feared by others, and remembered for both his victories and his brutal campaigns in France. Historians debate why he got the nickname, maybe because of his armor, or maybe because of his habit of setting towns on fire. Either way, he wasn't lurking in a dark tower, brooding about vengeance. The sinister edge of the Black Knight came much later. By the 19th century, romantic literature and early Hollywood films turned the term into shorthand for villains, mysterious loners at jousts, morally gray warriors, sometimes even shirtless, for no apparent reason. But back in the real Middle Ages, Black Knights weren't cursed anti-heroes. They were just nobles who wanted their armor to match their banners and maybe look intimidating while doing it. And speaking of stories that sound like fantasy, how about a monastery in the middle of a swamp? Local folklore in the English Fenlands told of Crowland Abbey, a shining city of stone and prayer rising from the bog. According to legend, monks somehow built bridges and walkways in the middle of all that muck, as if divine stubbornness alone held it up. For centuries, scholars dismissed the tale as exaggerated folklore. Who would build something so important in the middle of a swamp? The answer, of course, monks. Recent excavations confirm that Crowland Abbey, founded in the 8th century and expanded through the Middle Ages, really was constructed in the Finland marshes. And those monks weren't just praying. They were engineering geniuses. Three-way symmetry, baby. You don't see that kind of architectural flair from a bunch of peasants swinging shovels after happy hour. So why build in a swamp? 2 reasons: isolation and tax breaks. Monasteries were supposed to stand apart from the sinful world, and nothing screams holy solitude like being surrounded by mosquitoes the size of pigeons. Plus, swampland was cheap, because no sane farmer wanted it. But the monks, they turned those marshes into a spiritual and economic powerhouse. They farmed eels, made cheese, traded goods, and somehow survived winters without developing trench foot. Crowland Abbey wasn't just a monastery. It was a miracle of stubborn faith, clever engineering, and a lot of damn socks. Proof that even the strangest sounding medieval legends often hide a soggy little nugget of truth. And speaking of strange legends, let's talk about Pope Joan, the mysterious woman who supposedly tricked the entire Catholic Church, rose through the ranks, became Pope, and then, according to legend, gave birth mid-procession. Your average medieval Tuesday. For centuries, her story spread in whispers, while church scribes tried to erase it with the desperation of someone frantically clearing their search history. Most historians today dismiss Joan as a medieval cautionary tale. Propaganda to keep women away from the altar, but there are odd details that won't quite vanish. Some chronicles mention a mysterious gap in papal records during the 9th century, right when Joan supposedly reigned. Coincidence or cover-up? Then there's the bizarre tradition of the sedia stercoraria, a ceremonial throne with a suspiciously hollowed-out seat, supposedly used to confirm that the new pope had, let's say, the correct plumbing. Officially, it's symbolic, but if your chair comes with a built-in gender inspection feature, maybe you're protesting a little too much. Art makes things even messier. Medieval tarot decks and murals sometimes depict a female pope figure. Was that Joan? Or just symbolic quirkiness from the same artists who happily painted dragons and holy manuscripts and occasionally gave horses human feet? Hard to say. So who was Pope Joan? A real woman erased from history? A medieval urban legend? A proto-feminist fantasy? The truth is probably somewhere in between. We don't have solid proof she existed, but we also don't have proof she didn't. Just a whole lot of very nervous medieval clerics trying to change the subject. And if she was real, she pulled off the greatest disguise of the Middle Ages and the worst gender reveal party in history. Now, let's shift to another legend with sharper edges. Friday the 13th. Why is it considered unlucky? Forget about black cats or broken mirrors. The superstition traces back to the dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar. Here's the story. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France decided he was sick of being broke and sick of the Templars having more land, more money, and frankly, better outfits than him. So, in one sweeping move, he ordered mass arrests across France. Hundreds of knights were seized, tortured, and accused of everything from spitting on the cross to worshipping a mysterious severed head, which, considering medieval relics wasn't even the weirdest accusation on record. And that wraps up today's dive into the strange shadows of medieval history. But trust me, this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, we'll peel back another layer of myth and madness you won't want to miss. So hit that subscribe button, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and I'll see you in the next episode.